February 16th, 1945. Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen woods still echoed with artillery fire as Private Thomas Reeves trudged through knee-deep snow. His battalion, decimated after 6 weeks of brutal fighting in the Ardennes, had lost 417 men. Among them, his younger brother Michael, reported missing 3 days earlier during a German counterattack. Now, as temperatures plummeted to 28 degrees below zero, Thomas faced a decision that defied every protocol, every order, and every instinct for self-preservation. The remaining soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division were ordered to hold their position at all costs. But Thomas had seen something in the morning's reconnaissance photos that no one else noticed, a pattern in the disturbed snow 3 miles behind enemy lines that matched his brother's unit formation. In the command tent, Captain Harold Winters studied Thomas's face with a mixture of sympathy and finality. "There's nothing out there but Germans and dead men, Private," he said, his breath clouding the air between them. "Your brother's platoon was overrun. We have confirmation." The maps scattered across the wooden table told the strategic story, a salient of enemy forces extending like a dagger between their position and where Michael's unit had last reported in. "No rescue mission possible," Winters concluded, his voice dropping. "I'm sorry." What Thomas did next would be recorded as insubordination, court-martial material under any other circumstances. But in the chaos of what historians would later call the bloodiest American engagement of World War II, his unauthorized departure under cover of darkness would either be forgotten amid greater tragedies or immortalized in ways no one could predict. The medical tent where Thomas had volunteered for the past 18 hours had given him access to something no ordinary private possessed: knowledge of a forgotten forest path that German intelligence had overlooked, a logging route used by local woodcutters that didn't appear on military maps. As medics worked frantically to stabilize the latest casualties, Thomas slipped away, carrying only a single day's rations, his sidearm, and a medical kit stolen from supplies. The temperature had dropped another 7 degrees as darkness settled over the Ardennes, the stillness broken only by the occasional distant rumble of artillery and the crunch of snow beneath his boots. Behind him, the American lines grew fainter. Ahead lay 5 miles of forest, controlled by battle-hardened SS Panzer units, who shot infiltrators on sight. 75 years later, in a sunlit living room in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 99-year-old Michael Reeves adjusts the oxygen tube under his nose and points to the faded black-and-white photograph on the side table. "That's him," he says, voice still strong despite his years. "That's the stubborn fool who had no business coming after me." His weathered finger taps the glass, tracing the outline of a young soldier's face, his brother Thomas, forever 22 years old, smiling beneath a helmet tipped at a rakish angle. "Everyone thinks it's a story about how he saved me," Michael continues, his blue eyes sharp with memory. "But that's not the whole truth. What happened in those woods changed everything we thought we knew about warfare, about survival, about how the human mind processes information when everything's falling apart around you." Back in the frozen forests of 1945, Thomas Reeves moved with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. Every step calculated, every sound evaluated. His combat experience had taught him to distinguish between the ambient noises of a forest at night and the telltale signs of human presence. The logging path, barely visible under fresh snowfall, wound through dense pine groves that provided concealment from German patrols. His training as a battalion runner before volunteering for medical duty had honed his ability to move quickly across difficult terrain while maintaining orientation. Yet nothing had prepared him for the psychological burden of this solitary mission. The knowledge that every step took him farther from safety and deeper into territory where discovery meant certain death. At the Pentagon, 3,000 miles away and 7 decades later, Major General Eleanor Mitchell slides a declassified folder across her desk. What Thomas Reeves encountered that night fundamentally altered our understanding of battlefield psychology, she explains. The folder contains yellowed pages of after-action reports and debriefing transcripts that remained classified until 2014. "For years, we've trained soldiers to follow a specific decision tree in combat situations," Mitchell continues. But Reeves operated on something entirely different, a form of intuitive pattern recognition that our current AI systems still can't fully replicate. The forest had grown denser as Thomas pushed northward, the moonlight filtering through pine branches, creating spectral patterns on the snow below. By 0300 hours, he'd covered nearly 3 miles, moving parallel to the German lines rather than crossing them directly. The sound of mechanized vehicles carried through the cold air from somewhere to his east, most likely a panzer division repositioning for the next day's assault. Thomas consulted his compass, making mental calculations about his position relative to his brother's last known coordinates. According to the reconnaissance photos, Michael's unit had been advancing along a ridgeline when communication abruptly ceased. If they'd been overrun as reported, survivors might have fallen back to a defensible position, perhaps the limestone outcropping visible on aerial maps. What Thomas couldn't know, was that 30 miles away in a field hospital behind American lines, intelligence officers were reassessing the very information that had prompted his unauthorized mission. Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, head of tactical assessment for the division, had noticed anomalies in the pattern of German deployments following the attack on Michael's unit. "The enemy movements don't align with a successful overrun," he told his staff, studying updated reconnaissance photos. "They're still maintaining a search formation, which suggests they haven't achieved their objective." Harrison's analysis hinted at a possibility that contradicted official reports, that some elements of the lost platoon might have escaped the initial attack. But with communications down and the front lines in constant flux, this revised assessment would take hours to reach the commanders at Bastogne, long after Thomas had slipped away on his seemingly hopeless mission. In the medical archives of the Veterans Administration Hospital in Philadelphia, Dr. Sophia Patel carefully unfolds acid-free tissue paper to reveal a small, leather-bound notebook. "This is Thomas Reeves's field journal," she explains. "It was recovered from his equipment after the events of February 16th and 17th, 1945. The journal's pages, filled with cramped handwriting and occasional sketches, provide a rare contemporaneous account of his journey. What makes this document so valuable from a medical perspective," Patel continues, "is how it demonstrates decision-making under extreme stress. Reeves was operating with incomplete information, in physiologically challenging conditions, yet his analytical processes remained remarkably coherent. As dawn approached, Thomas reached the base of the ridge where his brother's unit had last been reported. The forest thinned here, increasing his vulnerability to detection. German patrols would become more active with daylight, and the relative protection of darkness was fading. In the growing light, he could make out tracks in the snow, multiple boot prints moving in formation, partially obscured by recent snowfall but still discernible to an experienced eye. Military logic suggested waiting for darkness before continuing, but Thomas calculated that the window for finding survivors, if any existed, was rapidly closing. Each hour reduced the likelihood of finding anyone alive in the sub-zero temperatures. The decision to continue in daylight contradicted every tactical principle he'd been taught, yet Thomas pushed forward, using the terrain's contours for concealment as he ascended the ridge. The patterns in the snow told a story that contradicted official reports. Rather than the chaotic scattering typical of an overrun position, Thomas observed signs of an organized withdrawal, boot prints in a staggered formation moving west along the ridgeline before descending into a ravine. These weren't the tracks of German soldiers, whose distinctive hobnail boots left different impressions. These were American combat boots, moving with purpose rather than panic. Thomas followed the trail, his medical training automatically assessing the prints for signs of injured personnel, the irregular spacing that would indicate someone being carried, the intermittent drops of frozen blood that would suggest wounded soldiers on the move. What he found instead was something tactical intelligence hadn't predicted, evidence of a deliberate deception. At intervals along the withdrawal route, the American boots diverged, creating multiple trail patterns before reconverging hundreds of yards later. This was a technique Thomas recognized from specialized training, a method to confuse pursuers and disperse enemy attention across multiple potential targets. Its execution required discipline and leadership, suggesting that Michael's unit hadn't been annihilated as reported, but had implemented survival protocols under competent command. The realization sent a surge of hope through Thomas's exhausted body. If they'd maintained this level of tactical cohesion during withdrawal, the possibility of survivors increased dramatically. The trail led toward a feature not marked on his maps, a deep ravine cut by a seasonal stream, now frozen solid, that could provide both concealment and protection from artillery. As Thomas cautiously approached the ravine's edge, the sound of a rifle bolt sliding into place froze him mid-step. "Password," came a hoarse whisper from somewhere below, the voice so soft it seemed part of the winter wind. Thomas stood motionless, mind racing. The challenge confirmed American presence, but he hadn't been briefed on the day's password before leaving. The wrong response would likely result in a shot from a nervous, trigger-happy survivor. "Medic," Thomas replied finally, deciding that identifying his function rather than attempting the password was his best option. 101st Airborne. I'm looking for Lieutenant Reeves's platoon. Silence stretched for 15 seconds, then 30. Finally, movement. A figure in snow camouflage rising from beneath a white tarp stretched over a depression in the ravine wall, rifle aimed steadily at Thomas's chest. "No lieutenant here anymore," the figure replied, not lowering his weapon. "He bought it during the first mortar barrage." The soldier's face was barely visible beneath layers of cold weather gear, his eyes revealing nothing about whether Thomas's brother might be among the survivors. "How many?" Thomas asked, slowly raising his hands to show he carried no weapon. 7 left from 28, came the reply. 4 mobile, 3 critical. No comms, limited ammo, no medical supplies. The rifle barrel dipped slightly. Not a surrender of suspicion, but an acknowledgement of their desperate situation. "If you're really a medic, prove it. We've got a man down here with a punctured lung." "Field treatment protocol?" The question was a test, one that any German infiltrator disguised in American uniform would likely fail. Thomas recited the standard procedure without hesitation, adding details about improvised materials that only someone with actual medical experience would know. The rifle lowered further. "Follow me," the soldier said, turning to lead the way down a nearly invisible path into the ravine. "And stay in my footprints exactly. We've laid mines along most approaches." As Thomas descended, the true ingenuity of the survivors' position became apparent. They had excavated a series of connected snow caves into the ravine wall, their entrances concealed by carefully constructed snow walls that blended with the natural terrain. No heat signatures would be visible from aerial reconnaissance, no smoke from fires that would give away their position. Inside the largest snow cave, dim light filtered through a small hole in the ceiling, illuminating a scene of desperate resourcefulness. 7 men, as the sentry had stated, occupied the space. 3 lay on improvised bedding of pine boughs, clearly in critical condition. The others maintained defensive positions or tended to their wounded comrades. All showed signs of extreme cold exposure and fatigue. Thomas scanned their faces, searching for his brother, but Michael wasn't among them. A staff sergeant with a makeshift splint on his left arm approached. "Sergeant Miller, acting commander," he introduced himself. "How the hell did you find us, and please tell me you're the advance party for a rescue team?" Thomas explained his solitary status while unpacking his medical kit, already assessing the wounded men's conditions. "I'm looking for Lieutenant Michael Reeves," he said, preparing a morphine syringe for a soldier with extensive shrapnel wounds. Miller's expression changed, a mixture of recognition and guarded caution crossing his face. "You're his brother," he stated rather than asked. "He mentioned you were somewhere in the division." Thomas nodded, continuing his treatment while bracing for the news he feared. "Where is he?" Miller glanced toward the back of the snow cave, where a narrow tunnel led deeper into the ravine wall. "Through there, 4th chamber. But prepare yourself, he's hanging on by a thread." The tunnel forced Thomas to crawl, navigating turns that presumably followed the natural contours of the ravine's geology. The survivors had created a complex that offered protection from both enemy detection and artillery, a testament to their training and determination. The 4th chamber was smaller than the main space, apparently reserved for the most critical cases. A single figure lay beneath layers of salvaged blankets and parachute silk, a crude IV setup, improvised from combat medical kits dripping fluid into his arm. In the dim light filtering through a small ventilation hole, Thomas could make out his brother's face, nearly unrecognizable beneath frost injuries and the pallor of severe blood loss. Michael's breathing came in shallow gasps, his chest barely rising with each labored inhalation. Thomas's medical training immediately identified the symptoms of advanced hypothermia combined with traumatic blood loss. By conventional triage standards, his brother would be categorized as expectant, unlikely to survive regardless of intervention. The standard protocol would be to allocate limited medical resources to those with better survival prospects. But Thomas had defied conventional wisdom just by being there, and he wasn't about to stop now. He unpacked specialized items from his medical kit, warming packs designed for treating cold casualties, plasma expanders, and antibiotics reserved for the most serious infections. Records from the 101st Airborne Division indicate that the survival rate for soldiers with Michael's combination of injuries under those environmental conditions was less than 3%, explains Dr. Raymond Chen, professor of combat medicine at Walter Reed Medical Center. What Thomas attempted was, by medical standards of 1945, virtually impossible. Today we understand that his brother's condition, severe hypothermia, combined with traumatic injury, actually created a form of suspended animation that might have contributed to his survival. But at that time, conventional wisdom would have classified him as beyond saving. Thomas worked methodically, applying his training with the precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. He placed chemical warming packs strategically, femoral arteries, carotid points, core body regions, to gradually raise his brother's temperature without triggering the fatal drop in blood pressure that could result from rewarming too quickly. He administered plasma expanders to address blood loss without overloading the compromised circulatory system. Each intervention balanced on a knife's edge of risk. The potential benefits weighed against possible catastrophic failure, all while knowing that enemy patrols could discover their position at any moment. As he worked, Thomas maintained a steady monologue, speaking softly to his unconscious brother. Medical science now recognizes the potential value of auditory stimulation for comatose patients, but in 1945, this was pure instinct, a brother refusing to believe that Michael couldn't hear him somewhere beneath the veil of unconsciousness. "I'm getting you home," Thomas repeated between technical observations about vital signs and treatment protocols. "Mom's waiting. Dad's expecting both his boys back, just like we promised." The one-sided conversation continued as he completed the initial interventions and began monitoring for response. Medical reality suggested hours before any improvement might manifest, if at all. Hours they likely didn't have before German patrols would intensify their search patterns with the advancing day. Sergeant Miller appeared at the chamber entrance, his expression grim. "Scout reports increased enemy activity to the north," he informed Thomas. "They're establishing a search grid, methodical sweep patterns. Found our original positions from yesterday. They'll work their way here by midday." The tactical situation was deteriorating by the minute. Even if Thomas's treatments began showing positive effects, moving Michael in his condition would almost certainly prove fatal. Staying meant eventual discovery. The mathematical probabilities formed unforgiving equations in Thomas's mind, survival chances approaching zero regardless of which option they chose. What happened next has been the subject of military tactical studies for decades. Thomas Reeves formulated a plan that contradicted established evacuation protocols, medical conventional wisdom, and basic survival instincts. Yet retrospective analysis by military historians suggests it may have been the only approach with any mathematical probability of success, however minimal. "We're going to split the group," Thomas informed Miller, continuing his monitoring of Michael's vital signs. "You take the mobile wounded due south through the logging trail I used. It's 3 miles to our forward positions. I'll create a diversion to the east, draw their search patterns away from your movement." Miller's objection was immediate. "That's suicide, and you know it." Thomas nodded, acknowledgement rather than agreement. 4 men with moderate injuries have a 97% chance of reaching our lines if they can move undetected, he countered, reciting probability assessments he'd learned during medical evacuation training. "That drops to under 20% if you're detected. My brother won't survive movement in his condition. I can't leave him, and we can't stay here collectively without all of us being captured." Tactically, division of forces with a diversion element maximizes overall survival probability. The sergeant studied Thomas's face, recognizing the mathematical certainty behind the seemingly desperate proposal. "What about the other critical cases?" he asked finally. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his eyes revealed the burden of the decision. "They stay with me. I'll continue treatment. If the diversion works and you make it back, send a rescue team to these coordinates." The plan's execution began at 0900 hours. Miller and 3 other soldiers capable of independent movement departed southward, following Thomas's guidance about the logging trail. They carried minimal equipment to maximize speed and stealth, their progress aided by fresh snowfall that partially obscured their tracks. Thomas remained with his brother and the 2 other critical cases, continuing treatment while preparing for the diversion that might give the others a chance at survival. From his medical kit, he extracted flares and morphine, components for a desperate strategy that relied on German search patterns and psychology rather than firepower. At precisely 1000 hours, when Miller's group should have covered approximately 1 mile of their journey south, Thomas emerged alone from the ravine half a mile east of their position. Moving with deliberate noise and visibility, he created a trail obvious enough for German patrols to discover, boot prints leading away from a hastily abandoned site where he'd planted medical wrappers and other evidence suggesting recent activity. The trail led directly eastward, away from both the ravine where the wounded remained and the southward path Miller's group had taken. In his pack, carefully arranged morphine syringes had been wired to a timed detonator constructed from equipment salvaged from the survivors' gear, an improvised distraction that would trigger 15 minutes after he began leaving his trail. The psychological calculus behind Thomas's diversion relied on German search methodology. Enemy forces, upon discovering evidence of American presence, would prioritize pursuit of active personnel over continuing their standard search pattern. By creating an obvious trail leading eastward, culminating in a small explosion that would signal active resistance, Thomas aimed to draw the entire German search operation away from both the ravine and Miller's evacuation route. The probability of his own survival in this scenario approached 0. The chance of being captured rather than killed was marginally higher, though interrogation and likely execution would follow. But the mathematical improvement in survival probability for both his brother and Miller's group justified the sacrifice by any tactical assessment. As Thomas moved through the forest, deliberately leaving signs for German trackers to follow, his medical training kept his mind focused on details rather than the likely outcome of his mission. He noted the time of each marker he left, calculated probable discovery intervals, adjusted his pace to ensure optimal spacing for the pursuit he intended to trigger. The morphine timer in his pack counted down as he pushed farther east, drawing enemy attention away from those he'd left behind. When the small explosion detonated at the prescribed time, Thomas was already 3/4 of a mile beyond its position, having doubled back through his own trail using techniques to minimize detectability. The distant shouts of German soldiers confirmed his diversion had worked, search teams converging on the explosion site, assuming they'd located active American forces. What Thomas Reeves implemented that day was essentially an early version of what we now call asymmetric tactical deception, explains Colonel James Harrington, instructor at the Army War College. With minimal resources, he manipulated enemy behavior through psychological exploitation of their procedural tendencies. Modern special operations forces train extensively in similar techniques, but Reeves improvised this approach under extreme conditions with no specialized training in diversionary tactics. The mathematical precision of his timing calculations, documented in his recovered journal, reveals an intuitive understanding of pursuit dynamics that we now teach as formal doctrine. While German forces concentrated their search eastward, following Thomas's diversion, Miller's group made steady progress southward along the logging trail. Their movement, slowed by injuries but undetected by enemy patrols, covered the 3 miles to American lines by 1400 hours. Upon reaching the forward position of the 101st Airborne, Miller immediately reported the situation to command staff, including the precise coordinates of the ravine where Thomas remained with his brother and the other wounded soldiers. The tactical situation, however, prevented any immediate rescue operation. Heavy German artillery bombardment had begun along the entire front, preparatory to what intelligence suggested would be a major offensive scheduled for the following morning. Inside the ravine, Thomas had returned to his brother's side, continuing treatment while monitoring the other wounded men. The diversion had succeeded in drawing enemy search teams away from their position, but the temporary reprieve only extended their survival window by hours, not days. Resources were dwindling, medical supplies nearly exhausted, no food remaining, water obtained only by melting snow. Most concerning, the body temperature of all three critical patients had begun dropping again despite Thomas's interventions. The laws of thermodynamics worked against them, the sub-zero ambient temperature gradually overwhelming the chemical warming packs and insulation measures. In his medical training, Thomas had learned that prolonged core temperature below 90 degrees Fahrenheit was typically fatal. His brother's temperature, measured as accurately as possible under the circumstances, hovered at 87 and declining. At 1700 hours, Thomas recorded a significant change in his brother's condition. Michael's breathing, previously shallow and irregular, established a more consistent pattern. His pulse, while still weak, had stabilized rather than continuing to weaken. Against all medical probability, he showed signs of responding to treatment. The status of the other two wounded soldiers had deteriorated, however. One had slipped into terminal stages of shock, despite Thomas's interventions. The other maintained stable vital signs but showed no improvement. Triage protocols dictated concentrating remaining resources on the patient, showing positive response. But Thomas continued dividing his attention and supplies equally among all three. His journal entries from this period reflect both clinical assessment and personal struggle, the medic's objective analysis alongside the brothers' desperate hope. Thomas Reeves's actions during those hours demonstrate the ethical complexity faced by combat medics, notes Dr. Victoria Hammond, medical ethicist at Johns Hopkins University. The tension between kinship obligation and medical impartiality creates what we now recognize as an impossible ethical position. Modern military medical protocols specifically prevent medical personnel from treating immediate family members when alternatives exist, precisely because of this dilemma. But isolated behind enemy lines, Thomas had no such option for transferring care. His decision to maintain equal treatment despite his brother's improved response represents extraordinary professional discipline under circumstances where personal bias would have been not just understandable, but nearly inevitable. As darkness fell on February 17th, Thomas's situation grew increasingly desperate. Outside temperatures dropped to 32 degrees below zero, testing the limits of their shelter's insulation properties. The chemical warming packs had long since exhausted their reactive components. The patient with terminal shock had died at 1900 hours despite all interventions. The remaining critical case showed signs of developing pneumonia, a virtually certain death sentence without antibiotics which had been depleted. Michael's condition had stabilized, but remained precarious. His survival contingent on maintaining the marginal thermal environment Thomas had established through continuous effort, rearranging insulation materials, using his own body heat, and employing every technique his training and improvisation could devise. Back at the American lines, Sergeant Miller's report had generated intense debate among the command staff. The coordinates he provided placed the ravine shelter less than a mile from what intelligence now identified as the assembly area for a major German armored thrust scheduled for dawn. Any rescue attempt would not only risk the personnel involved, but potentially compromise the element of surprise for the Allied counteroffensive, being prepared in response to the anticipated German attack. Strategic calculations weighed the lives of 3 men, one probably already dead, based on Miller's description of their conditions, against operational security for actions that might determine the battle's outcome and affect thousands of lives. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, whose earlier analysis had questioned the reported annihilation of Michael's unit, advocated for a limited rescue operation. Intelligence indicates a 90-minute window between 2300 and 030 hours, when German patrol density in Sector 4 will be minimized, he told the planning staff, indicating the area surrounding the ravine on tactical maps. A 2-man team could reach the coordinates, extract survivors if any remain viable for movement, and return before the window closes. The operation carried significant risk, but aligned with the division's commitment to recovering personnel when tactically feasible. Command approved the mission with explicit parameters, 2 volunteers, minimal equipment, and strict adherence to the identified time window. Inside the ravine shelter, Thomas had made a critical decision. With temperatures continuing to drop and resources exhausted, Maintaining two patients had become impossible. The soldier with developing pneumonia had lost consciousness, his breathing increasingly labored despite Thomas's efforts. Michael, while still critical, showed the greater probability of survival based on response to treatment. Thomas consolidated all remaining resources around his brother. Additional insulation from the deceased soldier's clothing, the last fragments of heat-reflective material, his own body heat as he lay alongside Michael in the darkness. His journal records this decision in stark medical terminology, the emotional weight evident only in a single underlined word at the entry's conclusion: forgive. At 2300 hours precisely, two figures in white camouflage left American lines, moving north through concealment positions, identified from aerial reconnaissance. Staff Sergeant William Donovan and Corporal Anthony Martinez, both experienced scouts with the 101st Reconnaissance Platoon, carried minimal equipment, medical extraction supplies, sidearms, and a collapsible stretcher. Their mission brief established priority for speed over stealth, acknowledging that the time window for the operation left no margin for cautious movement. The temperature had dropped to 34 degrees below zero, creating both tactical advantage and survival threat. German patrols had reduced frequency in the extreme cold, but any injury or delay would result in rapid hypothermia for the rescue team. Thomas had no knowledge of the rescue attempt forming beyond enemy lines. In the ravine shelter, his focus had narrowed to a single objective: maintaining his brother's core temperature through the night. The second wounded soldier had died at 21:40 hours, leaving only Michael alive among the original 3 critical cases. Thomas's own condition had deteriorated significantly, with symptoms of hypothermia becoming increasingly apparent in his journal entries. Handwriting grew erratic, thought patterns showed disorganization, and monitoring intervals became inconsistent. Yet certain entries maintained remarkable clarity, particularly those documenting his brother's vital signs, suggesting that Thomas was prioritizing medical observation even as his own cognitive function declined. At 23:40 hours, Thomas recorded a development that defied medical explanation given the circumstances. Michael opened his eyes, maintaining consciousness for approximately 30 seconds. No verbal communication occurred, but eye tracking suggested environmental awareness rather than merely reflexive response. Thomas administered the last drops of water from his canteen, noting that his brother's swallowing reflex functioned normally, a significant positive indicator amidst otherwise dire circumstances. The journal entry concludes with a single sentence that military historians have cited as exemplifying the psychological foundation of the American combat medic tradition: continued survival, now mathematically possible. Donovan and Martinez reached the ravine's edge at 01:15 hours, 15 minutes behind their mission timeline, due to unexpected German movement that forced a detour. Using the coordinates provided by Miller, they located the concealed entrance to the snow cave complex. The site appeared abandoned at first inspection, with no signs of recent activity on the surface, a testament to the survivors' discipline in maintaining operational security. Martinez secured their approach route, while Donovan investigated the entrance, weapon ready in case the position had been discovered and occupied by enemy forces. What he found instead was a single occupant, Thomas Reeves, severely hypothermic but conscious, positioned protectively beside his brother's still form. One survivor confirmed, Donovan reported via short-range radio. The transmission kept brief to minimize detection risk. Second survivor present, critical condition, requires extraction. The rescue team had prepared for up to 3 survivors based on Miller's report. Finding only 2, one barely conscious, one appearing near death, simplified the logistics but intensified the time pressure. Both Reeves brothers showed advanced hypothermia symptoms, their survival contingent on immediate evacuation to medical facilities. Martinez deployed the collapsible stretcher, while Donovan administered emergency stimulants from their medical kit, attempting to bring Thomas to sufficient consciousness for assisted walking. The clock was ticking on both their extraction window and the biological viability of the survivors. What happened next would later be described in Donovan's after-action report as the most remarkable demonstration of medical competence under extreme conditions he had witnessed throughout the war. Thomas Reeves, despite his severely compromised physical state, provided a precise, clinically detailed briefing on his brother's condition, treatment administered, response patterns, and critical care requirements for transport. The information, delivered through chattering teeth in fragmented but coherent sentences, gave the rescue team essential parameters for the evacuation. Most significantly, Thomas identified specific movement restrictions necessary to prevent catastrophic circulatory collapse during transport, knowledge that medical specialists later confirmed likely saved Michael's life during the extraction. The level of detail in Thomas's medical briefing, as documented in Donovan's report, demonstrates an extraordinary compartmentalization of cognitive function, explains Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, neurologist specializing in hypothermia cases. His core temperature was estimated at 91 degrees Fahrenheit, a level at which most individuals experience significant cognitive impairment. Yet he maintained access to complex medical knowledge while suppressing the effects of his own condition, a neurological feat that challenges our understanding of how the brain prioritizes information under extreme physiological stress. The extraction began at 01:45 hours. Michael, secured to the stretcher with thermal wraps from the rescue team's supplies, was carried by both Donovan and Martinez. Thomas, having refused assistance despite his condition, followed behind under his own power. A medical impossibility, according to physiological models, yet documented by multiple witnesses. The return journey required a more circuitous route than the approach, adding nearly a mile to their travel distance to avoid German patrol sectors identified through radio intelligence. Thomas collapsed twice during the journey, each time regaining his feet after brief interventions from the rescue team. His focus remained entirely on monitoring his brother's condition during transport, repeatedly checking the stretcher configuration to ensure optimal positioning for circulatory stability. They reached American lines at 03:20 hours, 50 minutes beyond the mission's planned extraction window, but still within the projected safe interval before German offensive preparations would intensify patrol activity. Medical personnel waiting at the forward aid station immediately implemented emergency rewarming protocols for both brothers, using advanced equipment unavailable in field conditions. Michael remained unconscious but showed unexpected cardiovascular stability given his prolonged exposure and injuries. Thomas, upon transferring care to the medical team, finally surrendered to his own physical condition, lapsing into unconsciousness that would continue for 38 hours as his body recovered from the combined effects of hypothermia, exhaustion, and what physicians later identified as moderate frostbite affecting 30% of his extremities. 3 days later, in a field hospital 20 miles behind the front lines, Thomas Reeves regained full consciousness to discover his brother in the adjacent bed, awake, alert, and beginning the long recovery process that would eventually lead to near-complete restoration of function. Medical officers who examined Michael's case noted what they termed unexplainable preservation of tissue viability despite prolonged exposure to conditions that typically resulted in irreversible damage. Contemporary medical understanding attributes this outcome to a combination of factors: the hypothermic state's reduction of cellular metabolic requirements, Thomas's precisely calculated rewarming techniques that prevented reperfusion injury, and interventions that maintained minimal but critical circulation to vital organs throughout the exposure period. What makes this case so significant from both medical and psychological perspectives, explains Dr. Morrison, is how it demonstrates the limitations of probability-based triage protocols. By conventional medical assessment of the time, Michael Reeves had survival probability below 5%. Resource allocation models would have categorized him as expectant, beyond reasonable intervention given limited supplies. Thomas's decision to continue treatment despite these overwhelming probabilities challenges our understanding of medical decision-making in crisis situations. The outcome forces us to question whether human judgment sometimes perceives survival possibilities that our statistical models fail to capture. The brothers' story might have remained an obscure footnote in military medical archives, if not for what happened next. During Michael's recovery, physicians discovered anomalies in his blood work that defied contemporary understanding, cellular preservation mechanisms that had allowed critical tissues to survive despite prolonged oxygen deprivation. Samples preserved for further study eventually contributed to research that revolutionized emergency medicine's approach to hypothermic cardiac arrest, establishing protocols now known as the Reeves method for treating patients previously considered beyond medical intervention. The technique, formalized in 1967, has since saved an estimated 17,000 lives worldwide, according to American Medical Association statistics. Thomas Reeves never sought recognition for his actions. After recovering from his injuries, he returned to combat operations with the 101st Airborne, participating in the final European campaigns before Germany's surrender in May 1945. His unauthorized mission to find his brother remained largely unknown outside immediate military circles until the declassification of related documents began in 2012. Military historians who subsequently analyzed the case note that under strict interpretation of regulations, Thomas had committed multiple court-martial offenses, abandoning his post, misappropriating medical supplies, and operating independently behind enemy lines without authorization. That no charges were ever filed reflects both the chaos of frontline operations during the period and what his commanding officer later described as recognition of moral courage that transcended military protocol. In the sunlit Lancaster living room, 99-year-old Michael Reeves carefully returns the photograph to its place on the side table. "People hear this story and think it's about a brother's love or some kind of heroism," he says, adjusting his oxygen tube. But that misses what Thomas actually did. He looked at a situation where everyone saw only one reality: a doomed unit, impossible survival conditions, mathematical certainty of death, and perceived a different pattern. He recognized possibilities that conventional analysis dismissed. Michael's weathered hand rests momentarily on the photograph frame. The real story isn't that he saved me. It's that he saw something nobody else could see. The pattern in the snow, the survival possibility that contradicted every probability assessment. That's what we should remember. Sometimes hope isn't just emotion. Sometimes it's the most accurate reading of reality that no one else has the perspective to see. The Reeves brothers' story has become standard curriculum in advanced military medical training, taught alongside tactical decision-making and emergency medicine protocols. What military educators emphasize is not just the medical interventions that saved Michael's life, but the decision process that led Thomas to undertake what appeared to be a hopeless mission. His unauthorized departure, initially classifiable as desertion under combat conditions, represented what military psychologists now term intuitive pattern recognition overriding procedural constraint, the ability to perceive tactical possibilities invisible to conventional analysis. This cognitive capacity, once dismissed as merely emotional decision-making, is now actively cultivated in specialized training programs for both medical personnel and reconnaissance units. Thomas Reeves passed away in 1982, having spent his post-war life as a family physician in rural Pennsylvania, where his practice became known for accepting patients other doctors had deemed untreatable. His medical colleagues noted his particular interest in cases involving circulatory compromise and tissue preservation, clinical challenges connected to his wartime experiences. In his private papers, discovered after his death, researchers found detailed notes on every seemingly hopeless case he encountered, each documented with the same meticulous attention he had applied to his brother's condition in that frozen ravine. The final entry, dated 3 days before his death at age 59, contains a single sentence that military historians have adopted as an unofficial motto for combat medical training: "Mathematical impossibility is often merely insufficient observation." Today, at the United States Army Medical Research Institute, a specialized facility houses what researchers informally call the Reeves Archive, thousands of case studies involving survival under physiologically impossible conditions. The collection, continuously updated with contemporary examples, serves as both research database and teaching tool for medical personnel preparing for combat deployment. What we're really studying is the gap between statistical probability and actual outcome, explains Dr. James Richardson, the Institute's director. The Reeves case taught us that medical intervention sometimes succeeds specifically because practitioners reject probability-based limitations. Thomas saw his brother not as a statistical expectation, but as a unique physiological system with survival potential that standardized models couldn't calculate. The scientific legacy of Thomas's desperate mission extends beyond military medicine. Researchers studying extreme environmental survival, from wilderness rescue to space exploration, regularly reference the Reeves case when developing protocols for situations where standard probability models suggest futility. NASA's emergency medical procedures for extended space missions incorporate specific interventions derived from Thomas's improvised techniques in the Ardennes. Climate scientists studying human adaptation to extreme cold have identified physiological responses first documented in Michael's medical records. What began as one soldier's refusal to accept his brother's reported death has evolved into a scientific framework for understanding human survival at the edges of biological possibility. Michael Reeves, the sole remaining direct witness to these events, has spent decades sharing their story with medical and military audiences. His testimony has contributed to training programs that emphasize what instructors call Reeves perception, the cognitive ability to identify survival patterns that contradict apparent evidence. My brother wasn't being irrational or purely emotional when he came looking for me, Michael explains to each new group of medical officers. He was perceiving something mathematically valid that others missed, the pattern in the snow that matched our unit formation, the tactical logic of our withdrawal route, the survival possibility that existed despite overwhelming contrary indicators. He saw a different reality, not because he wanted to, but because he could. As the sun sets over Lancaster, casting long shadows across the living room, where so many military historians and medical researchers have conducted interviews, Michael Reeves offers one final reflection on the events of February 1945. People ask if I believe in miracles after what happened, he says, his voice strong despite his years. I tell them no. I believe in observation, in perception that goes deeper than surface evidence. Thomas didn't defy reality when he came looking for me against all logic. He perceived a deeper reality that everyone else missed. The old soldier smiles, touching the photograph one last time before night falls. That's the real legacy worth preserving. Not just the medical techniques or tactical lessons, but the understanding that sometimes what looks like hopeless defiance of reality is actually the most accurate perception of a reality no one else can see. 75 years after those frozen days in the Ardennes forest, military medical protocols have incorporated what was once considered Thomas Reeves's irrational decision into standardized training. Combat medics learn not just the physiological interventions that saved his brother's life, but the perceptual framework that led to his unauthorized mission. Mathematical probability remains essential to battlefield medicine, explains Major General Mitchell at the Pentagon. But equally essential is the recognition that statistical models sometimes fail to capture survival possibilities that human perception can identify. We teach Reeves's story not as an exception to medical logic, but as an expansion of how we understand that logic, a reminder that sometimes the most accurate assessment of reality looks exactly like hope.